Well, hope you're all having a fabulous first start to the first day of DevDays, and you're ready to learn about structure definition and capability statement. I am joined with Nick Hatt, a senior developer from Redux, and he's going to talk all about that today. So take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Vivian, and hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Vivian said, I'm Nick. I'm a developer at Redux. Here's some of my contact info if you want to go look me up during the talk, if I'm especially boring. And yeah, I'm here to teach you about FHIR from the perspective of OpenAPI. So let's get the slides moving here. My background is as a software developer, so I feel pretty comfortable talking about both of these topics. You know, I have a commit on the FHIR repository, like one line change, but still proud of that. And I work at Redux, and we're a very developer-focused company. So we think a lot about ergonomics of how developers use APIs, and we try to focus on making it the best experience possible. A little bit of trivia about myself. This is my second time speaking at DevDays. You can find my first talk on YouTube all the way back from 2018 in Amsterdam. So quite a bit different circumstances this time around, but still super stoked to be sharing this with you all. And yeah, I hope the audience here, I mean, the DevDays community is usually pretty technical and pretty up on everything. But hopefully you're someone who works with APIs and really likes using them. You maybe know OpenAPI a little bit or have used it or at least seen it. And you want to learn about FHIR a little bit more deeply, right? Like how FHIR interacts with OpenAPI. And if you maybe have dug a little bit further, like why FHIR is the way it is. Is it just weird or is it something else? So I wanted to start the talk with a little bit of spice. If you go back in the FHIR Zulip and search OpenAPI, maybe you're doing some research for a talk like me. Shoot, my annotate's not working here. Hold on. All right, anyways, lost my mouse. Sorry. Okay, so Graham here in 2018 was asking the FHIR community at large, hey, I can generate OpenAPI from capability statement. It's built into the core Java reference implementation, but someone is out there telling me like, hey, the biggest problem with FHIR is it doesn't support OpenAPI. What gives, right? Like it's there, it works, but people are just confused. Like, why aren't they finding that feature? Why aren't they like engaging with it that way? This is 3 years ago, but does that disconnect still exist? Going to kind of probe that a little bit, and I asked the question already in the app. If folks want to respond or kind of get your brain thinking, let's just go over the OpenAPI real quick. So OpenAPI is something that developers generally like. The typical model here is your happy developer on the left here is selling an API, some kind of SaaS product maybe. They create OpenAPI specifications for their APIs, which they then share with their customers. So this happy developer on the right here, she can sort of take that OpenAPI specification, generate code from it, use any other number of cool tools that are out there that use OpenAPI as sort of their core. And then ideally she pays our developer on the left to use that API. So it's a great marketing tool. It's a great sort of like just developer productivity tool. If our happy developer on the right can get her, her code working with your API faster, you get paid faster. The other big use case is, that cool developer on the left there can also use OpenAPI to upload it to a bunch of cloud hosting providers and spin up infrastructure. So tools like API Gateway and AWS and stuff like that take OpenAPI as input, can sort of scaffold all your resources that you need, even if it's FHIR, and you have sort of a working base to go and make customizations on. So it's really valuable for him, and it's really valuable for the cloud computing companies because he's going to pay them now to use their resources. And again, time to market. With that OpenAPI spec, he was able to create a whole bunch of things really fast. So I guess going back to the question, Graham, it's a really great thing, OpenAPI. Why isn't there just a big download OpenAPI button on hl7.org/FHIR? Like, so the FHIR documentation page kind of has you going in a whole bunch of different directions. Most APIs that you would see out in the wild, they would have this big button that say like, here's the documentation, here's the OpenAPI spec, download it and run it in Postman or do anything like that. Wouldn't it make so many developers' lives easier, right? Isn't obvious how to do it, right? You can generate OpenAPI from FHIR, we know that. And FHIR is just an API. So I don't know if anybody knows this guy from TikTok, but from a certain perspective, it seems like FHIR is really complex. You have all these profiles, these implementation guides, value sets. You sort of have to build all this stuff to get something working. Can't you just replace it all with OpenAPI? And I think the answer might surprise you. The answer is kind of yes, but OpenAPI is really good at describing APIs, and what an API is in FHIR is not always clear. I think you could ask the same question of why Epic, Cerner, and any number of EHR vendors don't have that same button. And I think, if you've dug into the FHIR spec, you know that you need to have a /metadata endpoint. And there's kind of a reason for that. So that exposes the capability statement, and we'll kind of get into what that means. But there is some design and some intention behind this. So stick with me, and we'll find that out in the talk. So the first really challenging thing about FHIR and sort of healthcare in general is that it's this multi-tiered, multiple party type of system. In the OpenAPI world, for example, it's just developers talking to developers. So that happy developer on the left, has much more control over their product than, say, a FHIR specifier or someone on a working group does. And then they work directly with the developer, and they're selling a product. In FHIR, we have everything starting from sort of a group of requirement builders. The FHIR-based specification, right, is licensed under Creative Commons. No one's really making money off of it. People are taking it, profiling it, and sort of, again, not making very much money from it. In a few examples here are US Core Implementation Guide, Saner, which is sort of an implementation guide focused around COVID, and the Da Vinci Project, which has a number of implementation guides around payer use cases. And this is sort of operating at maybe more academic level, right? Like you're looking at a business case, sort of matching FHIR to the problem. Maybe you write some code for sample implementations, but it's not an actual API. You can't query anything that comes out of these things unless it's a sandbox or something like that. The next here in the FHIR implementation is sort of this capability layer. So these groups produce working software that supports some part of FHIR. They do it because FHIR is great, but they also do it because sometimes the US federal government requires it or incentivizes it. On the left here, you can see these charts. These are from the federal government. This is the office responsible for picking FHIR and sort of setting the standards that EHR vendors need to use from a interoperability perspective. And on the left is sort of the inpatient market share for vendors, and on the right is outpatient. And you'll see there's a few big heavy hitters, but there's a very, very long tail, right? So we've already gone from sort of the FHIR core to the implementation guide writers, but maybe, a dozen or so different groups of people who are working on FHIR, now to hundreds. So we've already fractured the implementation into hundreds of different software companies who need to go and build it. And this starts to show up in our daily lives. So where I live, my hospital is on Meditech. My sort of like PCP is on Allscripts, and Geisinger is down the road. If I ever decide to go there, they're on Epic. So I have my chart in a mix of places, and I can't really access them all from one FHIR API. At best, it's going to be 3, but it might even be more than that. To sort of throw gas on the fire, the federal government has also required FHIR APIs from insurance companies. And in some cases, it's not really an incentive, it's more of a requirement if they want to sell federally sponsored plans. So just add more long tail here, and you get a lot of implementation differences. The final tier here is what I'm going to call instances. This is where the actual rubber meets the road. These are the actual APIs that our happy software developer here now pictured can use. I use the US News top 20 hospitals as a proxy for this, but this could be anyone who buys software from someone on the last slide. So it could be a 1 doctor practice. It could be, a 50 hospital health system. And they will likely have multiple instances depending on the use case, right? So a large hospital could have multiple geographic regions, and those are just sort of functionally different FHIR APIs. They each need their own endpoint. You could have, in most cases, you do have a test environment, so that's sort of a different URL, different set of security concerns, and this is sort of what I call the edge, and this is where it makes sense to actually generate OpenAPI. At the same time, though, this is also the beauty of capability statement in FHIR. So if you haven't seen capability statement, go to the resources tab in FHIR. It's the very first one. It's sort of the backbone of FHIR. It's so beautiful because it has these applications across the continuum. So on the right hand top here, I have Epic's capability statement for their sandbox, and that describes an instance, right? That describes a test sandbox I can go and hit. And on the bottom here, I have capability statements that are published as part of the US Core Implementation Guide, right? So that's really, really powerful because it's saying like, here's what a server who implements this should look like, and here's what a client who is like built to use this server should also be able to do, right? You can't do that with OpenAPI, which is really powerful. Those last few slides, I didn't choose those terms, requirements, capabilities, and instance willy-nilly. They are actually literally part of the capability statement documentation. So there is really a lot of thought that has gone into FHIR, and sometimes you don't necessarily appreciate it right away. When you look at OpenAPI, this is just sort of a concept that does not exist in the spec at all. Everything that OpenAPI describes is intended to be a literal instance, and you can't necessarily use it to describe a hypothetical server, right? There is a flip side to this where it's harder to generate those things at the edge. So HL7 doesn't really know much about the implementation details of a given EHR vendor, enough to produce a reliable OpenAPI document, right? This sort of stuff you're going to see in that US core capability statement. They also generate OpenAPI off of it, but it's just sort of a lowest common denominator. So a server may support more, but it's just sort of like the minimum viable thing you need to do to be compliant. Similarly, a given EHR probably doesn't know much about how their customers are using FHIR. So if I sell to a large hospital system, they might be using a lab system. They might be using, a specialty like oncology product. Those might also have FHIR servers, and I need to merge both the EHR, the lab system, and that specialty system into one gateway, or you see kind of these facade service patterns that individual health systems are building to sort of meet that problem where they give their developers one path. But the good news is you can make OpenAPI out of FHIR. You basically have 3 ingredients. The first is the http.html documentation page on the FHIR, the RESTful FHIR documentation. That sets a lot of rules that you would typically find in OpenAPI. So the responses, different, the fact that you use _search to do a post search, things like that are documented there. And you would just sort of hard code those into your generator. Then you need some resource definitions. So we'll talk about this in the second half of the talk. This is where structure definition comes in. But you want to have sort of a shape of the objects that are inputs and a shape of the objects that are outputs from your API. And you can get all those from FHIR. And then finally, that beautiful part is that capability statement. It tells you which resources are actually supported, in a given instance, which search parameters are supported. And then there's a bunch of other cool stuff that people are doing with it. For example, Smart gives you extensions that tell you where the URLs are to authenticate, get a token and OAuth and stuff like that. So it's a very, very useful tool. Encourage you to check it out. And we'll talk a little bit more about how Redux is using or has faced this problem and how we solved it at the end of the talk. If I'm starting to lose you, I wanted to put this diagram in here. It's always easier to just go back to Pokemon when you're lost. So I actually stole this from this blog post below about how OpenAPI and JSON Schema diverge. So that's something we're going to talk about. But basically, you can think of both of these, worlds, OpenAPI and FHIR, being divided into 2 parts. One is the data model, and one is the service model. So JSON Schema in OpenAPI represents that data model. And if you're thinking about Pokemon, that might be sort of that how you represent a Pokemon, how you represent an ability, how you represent the different gyms in different cities. That's roughly equivalent to structure definition in FHIR. And the service model is sort of both baked to the protocol that you use to exchange those things and sort of the verbs that you use on it. So in this case, you can create a Pokemon, you can list all the Pokemon. Maybe you have a Pokedex and you list the Pokedex. You can do different search parameters, right? So you can say, what are the Pokemon I haven't collected yet? Things like that. And again, then FHIR, that corresponds to that HTTP documentation as well as the capability statement. I'm going to encourage everyone to write down your questions in the Whova app. I've been to a few sessions today and there are not a lot of questions, so I really want you to stump me. And that's a challenge. I've laid it down. Cool. So as I transition into that data model part of it, I'm going to just focus more on things that are hard because this is a sort of starting to get very academic, and I think it's worthy of a book. I'm not going to write that book, but I'm just going to kind of complain about things that OpenAPI doesn't do well, that FHIR does do really well. So please bear with me. I think the first place to start, if you go to FHIR Zulip and you search OpenAPI or Swagger, OpenAPI used to be called Swagger. Make what you will of that naming choice. But you'll see a bunch of discussion about how OpenAPI's use of JSON schema is not JSON schema, and that's true. They did finally address this. They sort of proposed it last year. This year, the release came out, and it's a minor version. So it's not like they broke compatibility, but now you just kind of have 2 ways to shoot yourself in the foot. If they do now have full compatibility with JSON schema, but the tooling isn't necessarily there, right? So if I was using anything in the 3.0 line, and again, a lot of those examples, the FHIR sort of tooling is stuck in the 3.0 world. It won't necessarily work with something that supports 3.1 because they, either just support native JSON schema and they don't support the older version, or more likely, it needs to be updated to kind of do both, which is unfortunate. The other problem is you're coupling your model and your service definition. The real beauty of FHIR is that ability to, well, first of all, you don't have to think about what the resources are. That's sort of a given. But you can just kind of keep layering onto models and not have to worry about the protocol, right? FHIR lets you exchange things not only as RESTful things, but you could send it over SFTP if you want. You could send it over, you can define any number of custom operations on a resource. So it's really powerful in that way. This is just something to watch out for as things move forward. OpenAPI is sort of more chaotic, right? Like FHIR structure definition is normative. It shouldn't change too much. And we can sort of start to build on that. You don't want OpenAPI to come out and you pull the rug out from under you, so to speak. The next big thing I really appreciate about structure definition is the ability to bind a given property of a resource to a value set. This is so huge in healthcare because there's so much value in value sets, no pun intended. The way you would do this in OpenAPI is really, really sloppy, I'll say. So the best you can probably do is just an enum of all the values that you could possibly put in a field. Value set in FHIR, the resource gives you so much more metadata. It's inherently more useful, and you can sort of reuse it across different places. And you can have third-party content authors update those without necessarily having to change anything else about how the spec works. But then as you get deeper into FHIR, you'll start to learn about slicing and profiling. Say, for example, you want to make a rule that a resource has to, use exactly one of 3 values from a value set of 10 things. That's just basically impossible to do in JSON Schema and OpenAPI. I'm not saying, this might be one of the reasons why healthcare interoperability is so hard. And so if we just got rid of this possibility, it might make things easier, but I don't know. I think it's really powerful, and sort of core to how everything works, that it's not going away, right? Another big part of FHIR is that it's format agnostic, and this is kind of beautiful in some ways. I know, I personally prefer JSON, but I might not in some point in the future. OpenAPI gives you XML support, but it's really what I would call tone deaf. Like XML may be sort of this old man's interchange format or woman's, but you should give it credit for its tooling. The OpenAPI doesn't support XSD schemas. It doesn't support schematron. If you look at actually sort of how FHIR XML tooling is versus FHIR JSON tooling, the XML tooling is better. So those XML schemas and those schematrons are like way better than the JSON schema equivalent. You can do deeper validation with them. Those kind of tools don't really exist in the JSON ecosystem at all. They may eventually, but today we're sort of in this awkward transition period. And I a few slides ago, I had Epic's capability statement, which interestingly, like if you just query for it, it comes back as XML by default. So if you were expecting JSON to be the default everywhere in FHIR, that might not be the case, right? You might need to just add a query parameter to get it in JSON. But there aren't really strict rules about, when you should use XML and when you should use JSON. And going even a layer deeper, a really powerful part of this is you're decoupling the models from the service model, but you're also decoupling the models from a particular format. So if some really amazing format takes off in the next 5 years, everything we've done in FHIR so far will still be useful. It's really just more of a problem of, okay, how do you add the FHIR representation of that new data, that new format? You know, YAML is basically JSON, but let's say like YAML just takes off and kills JSON. Well, okay, now you have a YAML version of FHIR. So that's really powerful, and that's something that OpenAPI doesn't really offer. Here's just a picture of sort of how FHIR treats the XML representation of stuff. Yeah, one other thing here I'll just draw your attention to is Webhook support. This is sort of arguably lacking in both. Like FHIR capability statement doesn't really have good support for webhooks, even though the subscription resource is maturing. Some of that kind of documentation is pushed into there. This is an interesting place where there's a challenger sort of emerging, where Async API is almost a competitor to OpenAPI, where they sort of have a spec much more focused on async workflows. At Redux, most of what we do is push, like real-time event notification. So we're kind of eagerly looking at how this gains traction in the industry. Cool. So I thought I would just share with you sort of how this talk came into my brain and what we're doing in this area. We're building FHIR documentation. We're sort of adding FHIR to our product. We have an existing set of 20 data models, and they're based around HL7 version 2 and CDA. And it sort of felt like the right time to add in query support, and FHIR is just like beautiful for RESTful queries. And we need a new documentation for it, obviously. So first thing we did was we kind of looked out there in the world of what was there. The previous one was written by me, and it was Jade and Pug. I mean, it's sort of like a write-only programming language if you've ever done that. So we've since switched to React, and we found, you know, quite a few options. This is sort of the beauty of OpenAPI, right, where there's all these tools in the world that let you use it. Redoc is an open source one that sort of generates this whole entire documentation, just give it an OpenAPI file. We got a prototype up and running, and it was super slow. So we tried with a few things like the US Core OpenAPI document that comes, you know, out of the box from there. And we ran into a bunch of problems. The biggest one is just that, well, maybe not the biggest one, but the most amusing one is that FHIR has sort of this infinite recursion, where an extension can have an extension, can have an extension. There's a few properties in FHIR that sort of do this. The JSON schema specs say that your schema must not run into an infinite loop. And that's not necessarily true of the FHIR JSON schema. So that might be something to submit to Jira. But, you know, we got past that. We just said, okay, an extension can only go deep one time. But it sort of highlights that, you know, OpenAPI is not meant to guaranteed to work with all OpenAPI tools. So they make you know, that Redoc tool makes assumptions. They actually handle the recursion okay. But you'll have to tweak it at some point. Here's where we're at today. We sort of just did it ourselves. The link is up there, beta.developer.redoxengine.com. It's still a work in progress, but you can check it out. It's really fast, so I hope you appreciate that part of it. And what we learned was, first of all, I just want to shout my colleague Benjamin Flessner. He's structured documents, co-chaired HL7. He's also an awesome developer. He built out a lot of our FHIR tooling for this project. We document everything as FHIR shorthand, so that's called FISH, or there's a bunch of fish puns involved. I think there's a few talks this week about it. This creates this really rich set of resources for us to work with. And one of the beautiful things about structure definition is that it's composable. So essentially in FISH and in structure definition, but it's really easy to do in FISH, you extend existing things. So we could start with just all of US Core and say, okay, we're going to use this as the base. And then as we need to add requirements, we just layer on top of it. And so our actual fish code we had to write is very small because most of it is actually in US core. We also generate OpenAPI. And so we sort of looked around at the options, and none of them really, specifically the FHIR to OpenAPI options, and none of them really kind of did exactly everything we wanted to do. So, we have some really sloppy stuff right now, but we think this is important, right? We wanted to give this to our developers. Going back to the beginning of the talk, why don't you just have that button? We want to just have that button. And OpenAPI does sort of invert the structure of a lot of FHIR stuff. So you're starting with the URLs, and then you're sort of going into the responses and the body. That's in some ways a lot more natural way to think about an API. And so we appreciate that about OpenAPI. We render the docs using a blend of both. So we use a tool called Gatsby on the front end that lets us kind of stick all that data in one place and mix and match. And then really very importantly, we only use StructureDefinition in the actual platform. So for validating and sort of doing business rules on FHIR resources, you should only use StructureDefinition. Ideally, you use the FHIR reference validator code in Java. Everything else is kind of just an imposter. So yeah, JSON schema doesn't give you very much validation at all. Okay, here's what we learned today. We're getting to the end of the talk, and I need to open my app and see if we have questions. I think Vivian's going to ask me the questions if they're there. You still have a few. Yeah, you still have a few seconds to put one in. To sum up, capability statement is basically OpenAPI. It works for way more use cases though. JSON schema and OpenAPI are moving targets, so they're not always compatible. And that's sort of a risk to base your product off of that. You're better off using capability statement and structure definition and FHIR. Those are normative, right? And finally, we decided to use the native FHIR stuff as the source of truth, but that does not mean there's not value in OpenAPI. It's really a nice thing, and the tooling ecosystem is better than FHIR, right? So as you go out into the developer tools world, OpenAPI is the lingua franca. So there's my contact info, and obviously via the Whova app you can find me. And yeah, I'll pull up my app here too. But Vivian, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. If you want to go back to your contact, just so everybody has it in case they're taking notes, and then I'll go ahead and fire off some questions. I think I'll start with the first one, which you actually got a yay, Nick. So you did a great job, and that was one of the comments you got. So the top question you actually got was from Janice, and it was, FHIR isn't an API, but an API framework. I think a lot of these types of problems come from everyone calling it an API. Have you tried responding with this type of clear language to explain why it doesn't act like a standard API?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the platform. This is my platform. So here I'm here to tell you that, yes, Janice, I think you're right. It's much more of a framework than an actual API. I try to tell everyone that I can, but there's definitely a lot more we can do as a community to sort of educate on that front. I don't know where people are getting that from. I think there's been a lot of hype around FHIR, and we're sort of starting to get to the point where people are building things on it, and they realize that these things are true. So yeah, happy to do my part at conferences like this, but it's definitely something I see a lot as a misperception.
Awesome. And Janice actually had a follow-up point. I'm not quite sure what point in your talk she asked this question, so I actually allowed everybody to unmute if there's any further clarification. But the question is, the federal government payer requirements also say that payers are supposed to collate and include all that clinical data you're now getting from 3 or more sources. So doesn't it simplify things once fully implemented?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So to fill everybody else in on the background, these requirements come from CMS, the US federal government. They essentially subsidize certain insurance plans, Medicare Advantage, things like that. And they can sort of set rules to say, hey, if you want to play in this space, if you want to offer a Medicare Advantage plan, you have to have APIs that do these certain things. One of them is that they have to expose any kind of clinical information that they got about the patient as sort of part of their workflow, right? So if they got a full, CDA document in order to process your claim, then they have to like expose that to you via an API. I think it's an interesting point that this could be a consolidation point where the payers sort of become these like really nice hubs. You're going to switch insurance plans probably less often than you switch providers. Some people just go to 3 different providers on regularly because that's sort of where their specialists are. Or they go to the ER and things like that. But again, they're sort of limited by not being the source of truth. There is a similar problem with the fragmentation as well, where there is a long tail of plans, and there's maybe let's say there's like 300 EHR vendors, and there's maybe 3,000 different health system instances that you need to connect to or something. There's probably like 400 payers or so. So a smaller problem, but still kind of a big problem for a developer to solve.
Definitely. So another question you have is, have you seen FHIR implemented in an enterprise data catalog?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have not used it, but I know a lot of groups are moving that direction. To me, I'm a little bit of a pessimist about how valuable FHIR is as sort of a reporting framework. It's an interoperability framework first and foremost. So a lot of the things it does, like extensions are the big one to me, are about flexibility over the wire and flexibility between systems, and not necessarily like efficiencies of queries or intelligibility for, say, a business analyst, right, to go in and pull stuff. So if I were building a data warehouse and my source of truth was FHIR, I don't know. I think Vivian, you're doing you're doing sort of a battle of the data models this week, which I'm excited to check out. I think that's a very I'll just say go to that session and learn about OMOP and learn about OpenEHR and how they compare to FHIR. And I think that will sort of hopefully enlighten you a little bit on that question.
What a perfect way for me to shamelessly plug it and promote our pub talks.
I got you, yeah.
Every day at 5, we're doing kind of a community. For those who used to go in person, we would kind of always do a bar crawl or something of that nature. So now we're doing pub talks, which basically just means we get to have a beer and yell at each other, but hopefully in a very, very respectful, great way. So definitely come. We're talking about OMOP, OpenEMR, and FHIR today, and everything around ADWs definitely plays into that. So yeah. We have a question from Janice again. She's on a roll. She talks about how FHIR resources, they're not a lot of the FHIR servers are not imposing backwards compatibility. And so she would like you to clarify why you think it's more stable from version to version than other things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I maybe did kind of speak out of turn there. When you have a normative FHIR resource, and I encourage everyone to go look at the FHIR maturity model. So every resource is sort of graded with a number, and then it gets to N, and that means it's normative. There are strict backwards compatibility rules once it's normative. Capability statement and structure definition are normative. There is a capability statement 2 in the build version of FHIR, and I've looked at it, and I have not talked to anyone who's working on it about what it does. But I think the changes make sense. And that's how they're going to break compatibility, right? There'll be capability statement 2, and capability statement with no number still works. With OpenAPI, they seem to be doing a good job of keeping compatibility and using semantic versioning. So they made this change it's .1, but they sort of still preserve the things. They would have to go to 4.0 if they wanted to actually say, okay, you can only use JSON schema now and not the sort of extensions we have. But FHIR's rules, I just trust the FHIR community more to preserve backwards compatibility, because they, OpenAPI is not developed by an ANSI accredited standards organization like HL7. It is a sort of they're transparent. They're on GitHub. They have a group of people who work on it and take feedback. But there's nothing, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I just trust the FHIR community more. So that's why we sort of chose that, in addition to all the other reasons, just being able to extend work that other people have done to profile resources. So that's probably like fourth or fifth down the list of reasons is the backwards compatibility part, but it is definitely a valuable feature.
Absolutely. And so again, I did allow everybody to unmute themselves. So feel free to unmute, ask questions, ask more questions in the chat. I will say Nick asked his own question, which I'm so curious to hear the answer, or his answer, which is, would you rather your head be the size of the size and the shape of a baseball, or the size and the shape of a loaf of bread? So Nick, you have to tell us, you seem to have a strong opinion here.
No, I think I go back and forth pretty much depending on how I wake up that day. I do have a large head, so sometimes you wish it would shrink, but I just don't know if I want it to be that small. Certainly banging your head on door frames and stuff like that, it's not an issue for me, but the balance of the bread loaf would just be a challenge. So I'm leaning towards baseball today. Yeah, could be convinced otherwise though.
I think it also depends on proportions. When we're not in person, it's hard to tell. I always joke, I never know how tall my colleagues are, because we're constantly Zooming. And so, if you're tall enough, you might be able to pull off a loaf of bread, depending on what the proportions are.
Totally. Yeah, and it depends. If you're mostly on Zoom, loaf of bread is the way to go, I think. So.
Absolutely. So we don't have any other questions. Well, Nick, you have a second question if you want to answer, a little bit about your use of OpenAPI, but I think if folks have questions.
Yeah, sorry, I raised my hand. It looks like it's not working.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Nick, for the presentation. It was great. I just went to the Firespank. I'm using basically the release 3 of it, and I'm looking at structure definition. It's maturity level 5. So should I expect it to change still? Because it's not N, as you said.
Yeah. So in R4, it is normative.
Oh, okay.
And you can take a look. I don't think very much changed actually between those two versions. FHIR does a great job of giving you a delta in each release of what changed per resource, and there's actually even like in some sense like automated ways to convert things between the two. Structure definition and capability statement are just so core to FHIR that they are super mature at this point. So I don't think you'd have to worry about it changing too much.
All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, if there's any other questions, you know where to find Nick, and everybody enjoy the rest of their dev days.
Bye, everybody.